The poet E. E. Cummings wrote, "May I be I is the only prayer, not may I be great or good or beautiful or wise or strong." And the sentiment that he expressed in that poem is really at the core, the heart of all the problems and struggles that I've had in my life. And really, it raised its head again yesterday when I was trying to record the first episode rather of this podcast that I'm just starting, called the Poet Delayed podcast. My name is Scott Edgar. I'm the host of it. I tried probably maybe 15 or 16 goes at it yesterday, and just never could get it going. And I finally got one that I thought would do, and then I went to bed and woke up this morning early, and that just kind of worked its way into my mind. The podcast did, and it just didn't sit right what I did yesterday, and I realized that this is exactly what I was doing again. I was trying to trying to make something perfect and appear perfect, and podcasts aren't going to be perfect, but as I thought about that, it really hit me. This is really something that probably a lot of people struggle with. Well, I know a lot of people struggle with it. I've talked to a lot of people about it. But another issue, yesterday as I was doing this, is I had written out an outline that this is kind of what I'm going to follow in the podcast. And part of that outline was that, the name of the podcast is The Poet Delayed. And the idea behind that is that initially I was thinking, there was a 20-year period up until about 2.5 years ago. There's a 20-year period where I really didn't write much at all. I just kind of went offline creatively and didn't write much. And so that's kind of what I was referencing rather, when I said the poet delayed, that I had that 20-year delay. But as I was thinking about it this morning, I mean, yeah, I've really, the poet's been delayed from as far back as I can remember. Yeah, I used to write poetry in high school and in my early 20s, but I guess it's I guess it's what we define as poetry or a poet. As I think about the poetry that I wrote early on, like when I said when I was in high school and up into my early 20s, as I think about that poetry and I go back and I read it, it almost, I don't know, it almost kind of feels like I was writing propaganda to myself, trying to convince myself that things were good and convince myself that that I wasn't struggling. In addition to that, I was writing it so that it would that if somebody else read it, they would say, "Hey, this guy's got his head on his shoulders. He's got a good head on his shoulders. He's in the right direction. He's going in the right direction. He's well adjusted, and look how positive he is in his poetry. He writes about these hard moments, but then it seemed like every poem I wrote early on was like darkness settling on me, and then the sunrise always coming in the morning, and there's always hope." And that's a great sentiment, but frankly, I didn't really feel that a lot. I felt a lot of despair, and I felt a lot of anxiety, and frankly, I didn't know what it was or where it was from. It just, I had islands and pockets of good times and happiness, and some extended amounts of those, but they're always in a sea of darkness and a sea of trouble. I guess and try not to be too dramatic, but there was always this heaviness and darkness that kind of weighed down, that I just kind of tried to plow through and put a shiny, happy face on. And again, I didn't know what it was. I just knew that it was. And for a long time, I thought I just had to try harder, pray harder, be more meek, more humble, and then eventually things would turn around. And like I said, there were good times, there were happy times, but the overall feel was a heaviness and a darkness and a frustration and a lagging feeling. And so really, when I say the poet delayed, what I'm referring to is that even when I was writing poetry, it was not authentic. It was not me. It was not I being I. Rather, it was me trying to be great or good or beautiful or wise or strong by somebody else's standard and definition. And that is never a good recipe. And for a long time, I didn't know why I was approaching life that way. I thought I was just trying to be amenable. Didn't want to cause a problem. I didn't want to rock the boat. I've often said that I've described it that if there's 5 of us and there's only 4 ice cream sandwiches, well, you 4 take them and I'll be fine. I don't need it. A needless, wantless attitude towards life. And I did feel like that was a virtue of sorts that I was able to forego. But the reality was that was me just avoiding difficult situations, not figuring things out, not working through those problems. And that was related to this as well, this going offline, this not being myself, abandoning my authenticity, my authentic self. And so I kind of just walked through life that way. And so the Poet Delayed really is not just that 20-year period. I understand. I had that epiphany this morning. The Poet Delayed is really as far back as I can remember. And we've all had trauma in our lives. Childhood trauma. We're all traumatized in some sense when we're kids. I tell my son asked me one time, Dad, why does it seem like everybody's got issues with their dad? And I just looked at him. I said, you know what, Ian, we've got a great relationship, but you're going to have problems with me too. But you can always come and talk to me. I tell my kids my door, my heart, and my ears are always open. So you can always come and talk to me and we can work it out, but you're going to have problems with me. We as parents, regardless of how hard we try, we end up doing stuff that traumatizes our kids. And, so we all have that. And for the most of my life, I tried to avoid excuses. For instance, my mom passed away when I was 10 years old. Pretty traumatic for a 10-year-old to have his mom pass away. And I tried very hard to not use that as an excuse. I had this line that, if it was ever brought up that, hey, my mom passed away. Yeah, that was hard. But ultimately, I'm responsible for my decisions. So, I just got to move on. And that's true. We ultimately make our decisions and we are responsible for them. But to ignore and not consider the fact that my mom died when I was 10 years old is ignoring a huge, it's just ignoring a huge issue that needs to be understood and needs to be addressed because it impacted me. It impacted me significantly. So while it is correct, I think, to say, no, my decisions are my decisions, and I need to take ownership of those. It's also important to understand that you had these things, that I had these things that impacted me, and that I need to address those things. And I've often now I'll say, well, yeah, it gives me an explanation, not a justification for my behaviors, but it gives me an explanation as to why I'm doing things, or why I'm making certain decisions, why I'm going this way and not that way, why I do things that are not helpful or productive, that I want to overcome these issues that I have. Well, to do that, you need to understand the root and where the issues are coming from. And in my situation, I know it's probably not the only situation, but in my situation, the death of my mother at 10 years old was a significant part of that. And so for so long, though, I just pushed it aside. I would joke about it. It was kind of my shtick, so to speak. It was I call it a showstopper. If somebody was joking or saying something about my mom, my line was, hey, my mom's dead. And everything kind of went quiet. Like, just kidding. It's okay, And that was not. I mean, that was me coping with it, not really realizing what I was doing, but that's what I was doing. I was trying to make light of it because I didn't want to deal with it. And it kind of reminds me of, well, and so I'm trying all these other avenues without really knowing what the root of these problems is or are. There's probably many roots, multiple roots at least. I'm trying to fix these things that are causing me problems, struggles, and causing struggles and problems for those people in my life because, I'm just not measuring up in certain ways that are necessary to have functioning, to have functioning relationships or I don't know how to phrase it, but to have relationships where you're taking care of your stuff and this other person's taking care of their stuff, and so you're working well together. I was having a difficult time in a lot of those interpersonal ways. When I was single, hey, I didn't notice it as much, but when you get married and you have kids, then all this stuff starts coming to the surface really sharply. But not knowing what the roots are to these problems, I just was trying all these other avenues. I just thought I had to pray harder, like I said, try harder, be more meek or humble, read scriptures, fast, or I would set up these strict schedules. Be up at 5 a.m, read for 30 minutes, study this or study that, write in my journal, write this for a little bit, and I was effectively setting myself up to fail because I'm sure there's some people who can manage their lives like that, but I have not been at that point to have that strict schedule. And so I would go a little while with it, doing well, feeling good, and invariably I would fail. And I was just setting myself up to fail. And I'm all the way back to, and I felt like I always went back to ground zero. Now, that's not the reality because I did make progress in a sense. I made progress with every effort and attempt that I made. But I felt like I went back to ground zero. I felt like I analogize it to juggling. I can juggle 3 balls, and I'll start out feet planted, and then I'll just start juggling, and things go well for a while until I lose focus, or I'll look to the left or the right, or I'll throw a ball that goes just a little bit too far, and my whole rhythm will be thrown off, and then boom, the balls fall down, and I got to grab them and plant my feet again, start from ground zero. And, if I had 20 juggles, I don't start at 20, I start at 0. And that's kind of how I felt about my life and my efforts. And frankly, it was really discouraging, and it kind of beat you down, and it beat me down at least. And it got to the point where I really just abandoned my wants and my needs. And I started living I felt like I had to just abandon things that I felt like I needed, or not even that I needed, just things that brought me joy. Like I needed to get down and it was, I had to ration things. It was, I like eating oatmeal without salt and sugar. If any of you have eaten oatmeal without salt and sugar, you know what I mean. It keeps you alive, but there's no joy in it. And a lot of my life was like that. And again, I'm not trying to say that I didn't have happiness or joy, because I did. I had pockets and islands of them, and some of them were for extended periods. But it was all within a sea of troubles. And I feel like, and so I went around trying to fix these things. But again, I didn't know or have an appreciation for what the root of these problems were. Not Hemingway. I love Hemingway, by the way. But Thoreau in Walden, he made this comment. He said, "For every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's one striking at the root." And in my case, there was me hacking at 1,000 branches rather than striking at the root. And just ineffective. You're just trimming the tree back. You're not, you're trimming the whatever the poison oak bush back. You're not hitting the root. You're not killing it. And so you keep suffering. You keep suffering from it. And so that was much, for much of my life, I just have not known what I was doing, frankly. And then last year and a half or 2.5 years or so, the roots have started to come into focus in my life, and I'm seeing, I'm these are things that I wasn't blind to, but I'm now acknowledging, well, some of them I was, but like, for instance, the death of my mother. I'm acknowledging the impact and understanding how that would cause a disruption in my emotional development, how that would cause me to abandon who I was. It had a significant impact, and I'm acknowledging that. And so that root is coming more clearly into my life. And there's other things that are coming up as well, and I'm looking at them and understanding them and knowing that I need to address these things and deal with them. And they're hard things. It's painful sometimes. It's, when you start understanding the root of your traumas and things that you have gone through, and you start recognizing the losses that you've had because of it, it's hard. It hurts. And one concept that I'm understanding now, because I'm feeling it, is that those traumas that you never processed when you were younger, they didn't go away. They're stored in your body. There's a book, I haven't read it, Vanderkolk, I think, is the author. The body keeps a score. I mean, this stuff is like stored in your cells, and it comes back, and you feel it, and it hurts as if it's happening now. And it's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing. But it's a necessary thing to become emotionally healthy, to reconnect with yourself, or for me to reconnect with myself. I know that I need to go through this, and I want to reconnect with myself. I want to be me. I want I to be I. And so I know that I need to work through these things. And fortunately, I have a loving family and friends that are super supportive of me, and I have a great therapist who has been instrumental in helping me understand that there are bigger issues here than just my inability to follow through on things that I've said I would do. There are bigger issues than that. I used to think it was a moral problem, or I just didn't have it. I wasn't born with that ability. I had to develop that, or I had to just be more patient. I just thought that there were spiritual problems, and they're not spiritual problems. They're emotional. They're trauma problems, and they need to be approached systematically. There's patterns to it, and I like when I see patterns, because if I see a pattern, I know that there's something that I can do to work with it. So now I'm starting to see these roots, and now I'm starting to be able to strike at these roots, and I feel like I'm having success. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of pain involved. So in this area of my life, success equals pain initially. And that's kind of a hard thing to face, because I guess it's just, there's always the analogy of, lifting weights or becoming running or something. I mean, success initially, well, I think always to make progress, there's always going to be pain involved. There's a no pain, no gain, I guess. So that principle applies more broadly than just in this theater of life. But I'm learning how to move forward, to process these things, and I'm learning to rely on friends and family to be more vulnerable and open, and to acknowledge what I'm dealing with, because I've tried for so long just either not acknowledge anything, to pretend to others, to myself to others for sure, and to myself, to pretend that there weren't problems, that I was on an upward trend, that the prevailing trend was upward, and it's not always true. And it's just hard sometimes. It's just hard sometimes, and that's okay. It's just part of it. And I'm learning to let my feelings settle in me, and to experience them and work through them. And it's not natural for me. It's not easy. But fortunately, I do have a good support group that's helping me. And that's really the purpose of this podcast, is I want to share things that I've been learning myself, on the chance that maybe it could be helpful for somebody. And it will also, even if nobody listens to this, I think that it's going to be good for me. It's going to be good for me to open up about these things, to share them, to put them out there. And I think as I do that, personally, I will have more realizations and understandings, and make more progress here. So this podcast is kind of a vehicle. It's the format of it is that each week I want to read one of my poems. I've used poetry like in the last 2.5 years. 2.5 years ago, I decided that I was going to start writing poetry again, and really to the end of to try to work through these problems that I've got. What is this feeling? What is this emotion that I have? And I'm going to write a poem about it, and in writing a poem, I find that I'm able, I try to break emotions down to smaller parts, where is this coming from? And then I try to use metaphors, analogies, and as I do that, as I break my problem down and try to express it in metaphor and analogy, I find I understand it better, and I see analogies, and I see it more clearly for what it is. And that's what I started doing 2.5 years ago. And I'll tell you, the poetry that I started writing 2.5 years ago, at least in my opinion, it's so much better than what I wrote back in high school and my early 20s. And I'm sure a part of that is just the maturation. I mean, I'm 48 years old now, and there's just something that comes with growing older. But there's also the fact that I'm not trying to write it for other people anymore. I'm not trying to be what other people want me to be, or to write it so that they'll read it. In fact, that was so bad for me that I would even write in my journals as if I'm writing it for somebody else. And I go back and I read my journals from then, and it hurts to read. I'm glad I have them, because it really, really brings into sharp focus where I was in my life and how I approached life. And so I'm grateful for the journals, but it's hard for me to read them because I wasn't writing them in any authentic sense at all. There were a couple entries in journals where I acknowledge that I'm not happy and things aren't going the way I wanted them to go. And it was interesting because I read a lot of my journals a few years ago, or I'm sorry, a couple weeks ago. And it was hard, but I came across a couple passages where I would acknowledge to myself that, you know what, things aren't really going how I think they should go, and I don't feel good. And when I read those passages, it was interesting. It was like just this a refreshment. It's like, oh, there I am. I can see myself. But invariably, I followed up that passage with, but I just need to be better, and I just need to be more faithful. And so I was trying hard to keep myself from acknowledging that things were hard, that things were not right. Anyway, fast forward to 2.5 years ago, and I started writing again. And I started writing like what I felt, not necessarily for other people. I just started writing for myself, like, how am I going to break this down? And one of the first poems I wrote that I'll read and in a future episode was called it is called Unconditional, and it's about my birth and my mom's relationship to me, and just in that moment. And that was really a process for me. That was really good for me to write that, and I'll get into that in the episode that I write. But so from then till now, my poetry, I've really tried to write to that end. Now, I don't think that all poetry needs to be therapeutic in that sense, in the sense that you're working through problems and breaking them down and so forth. I think some poetry is just beautiful because it's beautiful. I mean, and I love words, and I love putting the words together. And sometimes I read poems, I have no idea what they mean, but I just love them. I love the way they resonate. I just love the way they sound, their cadence and so forth. And as an example of that is a poem by William Carlos Williams. It's called The Red Wheelbarrow. It says, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain water beside the white chickens. And that's it. And I think it's a beautiful poem. Now, maybe there's some meaning to that I don't get. I'm sure somebody's extruded some meaning out of that. But for me, I just read it and I just think it's beautiful. The simplicity and the scene that it describes, and just how he puts the words together and the cadence and the rhythm of it. I just think it's beautiful. And so I don't think all poetry needs to have that driving meaning or needs to be used to solve problems, but it can be that. And I've used that as a tool, as an axe, so to speak, to strike at the root of my problems. And that's what I want to do. So each episode of this podcast, I'm going to I have planned to have a guest with me each time, so I think maybe that'll be a little bit easier than trying to monologue it. But I want to read a poem, one of my poems that I've written, and then I'll kind of just briefly share the inspiration and anything else about the poem that I think is unique or something that I want to share about it. And then at that point, my guest and I will just talk about if, maybe the poem or just the theme in the poem, like what issues were being dealt with here. How have they presented in your life, and are there things that you've learned when addressing this type of a problem, and what type of issues has this caused for you? It's just kind of working through it. Now, I'm not a therapist, so it's not. I mean, I'm certain I'm gonna maybe be out in left field on occasion, but so keep that in mind. I'm not a therapist. But I'm sincere about these issues, and I'm sincere about healing myself from these problems so that I can be a whole human, a complete person eventually. At least that's what I'm going to strive to, and I don't have any. I'm not so disillusioned that I feel like I'm going to get to be a complete whole person eventually. But there's a lot of joy and satisfaction in working towards that. In fact, I kind of feel like I'd rather never get there and just always be working towards it. That way I have I'm making progress. I like progress. So then we'll talk about the poems and talk about the issues, and I hope that through those conversations that I and my guest, there's something maybe that we can share and say that touches your heart. And I want to give an example of that in my life. I was I don't remember what year Jojo Rabbit came out. That movie, fabulous movie. But the poet Rilke was featured prominently in that movie. His poetry was, at least, and I'd never heard of him at the time. I've since he's since become very dear to me. But at the end of the movie, the screen goes black. Everybody starts getting up, and on the screen, a verse from one of his poems comes up. And the verse says, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." And as I sat there in the theater in the darkness, reading that on the screen, I just was overwhelmed, just overwhelmed with emotion. I mean, it's that feeling where I'm gonna cry. There's, and oh crap, there's people around me. Keep the lights in the theater down, please. But everybody's getting up, and I read that, and that moved me, and that just went straight to my heart. I went home, found the poem, and I read it, and the full poem reads, "God speaks to each of us as he makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You, sent out beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing, embody me, flare up like a flame and make big shadows I can move in. Let everything happen to you. Beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand." That poem has become so important to me in my life. And as I've gotten to know his poetry more, so much of his poetry means so much to me. I mean, it has really opened my eyes to a lot of things. It's touched me. I feel a connection with him. I'll just say I feel a connection with him over the years. I think he died in like the 20s. And my poetry may not touch you, and that's okay. But I'm hoping that something that we share on the podcast may touch you. That's my hope, and that's the purpose of this podcast. It's a vehicle for me to share these things. I do want to share a poem today, and it kind of goes with this whole theme that I've been talking about. And the poem is called "The Poet's Call." I don't remember when I wrote this. It was within the last 2.5 years, and it's a poem that some poems just fall into my head. Some I really had to work hard on. This one just fell into my head, and it's not a technically complicated poem, so maybe that's why. But it just fell into my head, and then it resonated with me. And the poem says, "Write hard words to break your soul against, redemptive words too, to bind it up again." And I have a notebook that I write my notes for poetry, and I just my poetry notebooks. And every time I open a new one, after I finished one and I get a new one, this is what I write inside the inside cover. Write hard words. Actually, in this book, write hard words to break your soul against, redemptive words too, to bind it up again. To remind me that's what I'm doing, because that's the last 2.5 years, that is what I've been doing. I've been writing this poetry, something, hard things and redemptive things. And it's been so rewarding for me. It's given me a lot. It's helped me find meaning in my life, and it's given me meaning, because I love writing poetry. I love the process, and I just love finishing a poem, wrapping it up, and I feel like I've been able to express what I want, it just brings a lot of joy to me, and it's healing for me as well. And so that's what this podcast is going to be about. My writing hard words. It's going to be about the hard words that I write and the redemptive words that I write. And if my poetry doesn't ring to you, that's okay too. No offense here. I just hope that as we discuss the poetry, that maybe something will be said, an idea will be expressed that will trigger something in somebody who needs that, and that it can either lead to some healing or lead to an understanding, or I just want to help people. I want to help myself, and I want to help people. I've felt that strongly as I've gone through this recovery process, and I've felt a strong desire to reach out and to share, and I hope that this is something. I hope that this podcast can do that. Anyway, thank you for listening. I just want to close with these words from Cummings, because I think it's beautiful. May I be I is the only prayer, not may I be great or good or beautiful or wise or strong. And I just hope that we can all remember that and work towards that. Again, thanks for listening. This is